Karen Whitmore was 44 years old when she walked into Judge Judy's courtroom that day, a third-generation real estate developer who had inherited her father's company at age 28 after his unexpected death from a heart attack. Over the next 15 years, she had built that modest family business into a $47 million annual revenue empire, owning over 200 rental properties across 3 states and earning a reputation in business circles as ruthlessly effective and absolutely untouchable. She drove a Bentley Continental with vanity plates reading "Own It," wore designer suits costing $5,000 or more, and carried handbags worth $15,000 like they were disposable accessories. Her office walls were covered with magazine features celebrating her as a self-made success story, a woman who had taken her father's legacy and multiplied it tenfold through what business publications called aggressive negotiation tactics and innovative acquisition strategies. But what those glossy magazines never reported, what Karen had successfully hidden behind expensive lawyers and generous political donations totaling over $250,000 in 10 years, was that her empire was built on a foundation of fraud, manipulation, and the systematic exploitation of elderly people who trusted her to help them during their most vulnerable moments. Karen Whitmore had perfected a predatory business model that specifically targeted elderly homeowners in declining neighborhoods, the kind of vulnerable people who were struggling with property taxes after losing a spouse, who were overwhelmed by home maintenance they could no longer afford, who were scared and confused about their financial futures. Her company would send what appeared to be helpful letters offering assistance through a senior support program, claiming to provide tax relief and financial guidance during difficult times. These letters were carefully crafted to create urgency and fear, warning recipients that they were at risk of losing their homes to foreclosure if they didn't act immediately. When frightened seniors called the number provided, they were connected with Karen's sales team, trained professionals who used high-pressure tactics to push vulnerable elderly people into signing complex contracts they didn't fully understand. The contracts were deliberately written in dense legal language with crucial terms buried in microscopic fine print, clauses that effectively transferred property ownership to Karen's company for a fraction of the home's actual market value. Seniors B. The television courtroom fell into absolute silence when Karen Whitmore, a wealthy real estate mogul who had bought her way out of consequences for 15 years, looked directly at Judge Judy Scanlon and uttered 3 words that would destroy her life forever. "I own you." What happened in the next 4 minutes was so brutal, so legally devastating, that it cost Karen $250,000, her entire real estate empire, and landed her facing federal charges that could send her to prison for 20 years. Karen had walked into that courtroom believing her $2 million net worth made her untouchable, that her connections to politicians and expensive lawyers created an invisible shield around her criminal behavior. She had no idea Judge Judy had spent the previous 72 hours coordinating with the FBI, the IRS, and state prosecutors to set a trap that would expose her criminal enterprise to 10 million viewers in real time. The words "I own you" hadn't even finished echoing through the courtroom before Judge Judy's eyes transformed into weapons of pure judicial fury, and Karen Whitmore's carefully constructed empire of fraud began crumbling around her in the most spectacular public destruction ever captured on camera. Before we show you the exact moment this entitled billionaire committed career suicide on national television, smash that like button right now if you believe wealthy people who think money puts them above the law deserve to be absolutely destroyed by someone who refuses to be intimidated. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications because what Judge Judy reveals about Karen's criminal conspiracy will leave you speechless and restore your faith that justice still exists in this world. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from because this story is going viral in 47 countries and counting, with over 200 million views across every social media platform imaginable. Trust me when I tell you that the next 20 minutes will be the most satisfying courtroom destruction you have ever witnessed, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why 3 simple words became the most expensive mistake of Karen Whitmore's entire life. This case wasn't just about one insult or one arrogant moment of entitlement gone wrong. This was about a predator who had spent 15 years running a sophisticated real estate scheme targeting the most vulnerable members of our society, elderly homeowners who had worked their entire lives to achieve the American dream of owning their own homes. Karen Whitmore had systematically destroyed 67 families through fraudulent contracts, manipulative tactics, and outright theft disguised as legitimate business transactions. She had stolen $4.7 million through a pattern of behavior so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that when Judge Judy finally exposed it to the world, even hardened legal professionals were shocked by the scope of her criminal enterprise. The plaintiff in this case was Margaret Chin, an 82-year-old widow who had lost her home of 50 years to Karen's predatory scheme, And what made this case truly extraordinary was that Judge Judy had been building evidence against Karen for months before she ever walked through that courtroom door. This wasn't just another small claims dispute for daytime television entertainment. This was a coordinated federal sting operation disguised as a TV court case, and Karen Whitmore had absolutely no idea that every word she spoke, every display of arrogance, every dismissive gesture was being used to build the criminal case that would send her to prison for 15 years. Believed they were receiving loan assistance or entering into a reverse mortgage arrangement that would allow them to stay in their homes. Instead, they were signing away the deed to properties they had spent decades paying off, receiving anywhere from 20 to 30% of their home's actual worth, while Karen would flip those same properties within 90 days for profits of 300% or more. The system that allowed Karen to operate with impunity for 15 years was built on money, connections, and the exploitation of power imbalances that made it nearly impossible for her victims to fight back effectively. She kept a stable of expensive attorneys on retainer, lawyers from prestigious firms who specialized in intimidating elderly victims into silence through threatening letters filled with legal jargon designed to terrify people who couldn't afford prolonged court battles. When victims did try to complain or sue, Karen's legal team would drag out proceedings with endless motions and discovery requests, driving up legal costs until the victims simply couldn't afford to continue fighting. She had made generous donations to local politicians over 10 years, contributions that ensured building inspectors and zoning officials looked the other way when questions arose about her business practices. 8 previous lawsuits had been filed against her company by victims who recognized they'd been defrauded, but every single case was settled quietly before trial with non-disclosure agreements that prevented victims from speaking publicly about what Karen had done to them. She had cultivated a public image as a successful businesswoman and philanthropist, giving speeches at real estate conferences about aggressive negotiation tactics, and featured in local business magazines as an inspiring success story of a woman thriving in a male-dominated industry. Behind that carefully constructed facade was a calculated criminal who viewed elderly people not as human beings deserving of respect and dignity, but as marks to be exploited for maximum profit with minimum risk. The specific victims of Karen's predatory scheme read like a catalog of American dreams turned into nightmares through deliberate cruelty and manipulation. The Martinez family lost their home of 40 years, a modest 3-bedroom house where they had raised 5 children and celebrated countless holidays, receiving just $45,000 for a property worth $280,000 in the rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. Robert Thompson, a 73-year-old military veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam, signed Karen's paperwork while undergoing chemotherapy treatment for colon cancer, his judgment impaired by pain medication and the overwhelming stress of managing a serious illness while living on a fixed income. He lost everything, and Karen sold his home 3 weeks later for a profit of $320,000. The Williams family, 3 generations living together in a home that had been in their family since 1958, were displaced within 60 days of signing Karen's contract, forced to split up and move in with various relatives across the state while Karen renovated their family home and sold it for a $400,000 profit. Across 15 years in 3 states, 67 families had been confirmed as victims of Karen's scheme, though investigators believed the actual number was likely much higher as many elderly victims died before they could come forward or were too ashamed to admit they had been deceived. The estimated total of Karen's fraudulent profits exceeded $4.7 million, and not a single victim had successfully recovered their losses or seen any form of justice until Margaret Chin decided to fight back. Margaret Chin represented everything Karen Whitmore had spent 15 years exploiting, and everything that would ultimately lead to Karen's complete destruction. At 82 years old, Margaret was a widow whose husband Thomas had died 3 years earlier after 47 years of marriage, leaving her alone in the modest home they had purchased together in 1974. Margaret and Thomas were Chinese immigrants who had come to America in their 20s with nothing but hope and a willingness to work harder than anyone else to build a better life. Thomas had worked in restaurant kitchens for 40 years, often pulling double shifts and working holidays to provide for his family. Margaret had worked as a seamstress for 35 years, her skilled hands creating beautiful alterations and custom garments while her eyes strained under inadequate lighting in the back rooms of dry cleaning shops. Together they had saved every possible penny, sacrificing vacations and luxuries and new clothes, pouring everything into the dream of owning their own home. When they finally purchased their small house for $32,000 in 1974, it was the proudest day of their lives, the tangible proof that their sacrifices and hard work had meaning in their adopted country. Margaret and Thomas raised 3 children in that home, watching them grow from babies to successful adults who went on to become a teacher, a nurse, and an engineer. The house held 50 years of memories embedded in every wall, every floorboard, every corner of the modest backyard where Thomas had grown vegetables and Margaret had tended flowers. They paid off their mortgage in 1995, and Thomas had cried tears of joy the day they made that final payment, holding the deed in his trembling hands and telling Margaret that they had truly achieved the American dream. The house that they had purchased for $32,000 was now worth $380,000 in a neighborhood that had undergone significant gentrification. But to Margaret it was priceless because every inch of it represented the life she and Thomas had built together through decades of love and sacrifice. When Thomas died 3 years ago, Margaret felt like half of her soul had been torn away, and the house became even more precious because it was filled with his presence in every room, every photograph on the walls, every piece of furniture they had chosen together. After Thomas's death, Margaret struggled to manage the property taxes on her fixed income from Social Security and Thomas's small pension. She was surviving but barely, and the weight of maintaining the home alone while grieving her husband of 47 years was overwhelming in ways that her children, despite their love and support, couldn't fully alleviate. That's when Karen Whitmore's company sent the letter that would change Margaret's life forever. The letter appeared helpful and professional, offering assistance through what was described as a senior support program specifically designed to help elderly homeowners struggling with property taxes and home maintenance costs. The language created urgency, warning that Margaret was at risk of losing her home to tax foreclosure if she didn't act quickly, and it promised solutions that would allow her to stay in her home while getting the financial relief she desperately needed. Margaret's limited English made understanding complex financial documents difficult, something she had struggled with throughout her life in America, and the fear of losing the home she and Thomas had worked so hard to purchase pushed her to respond to the letter seeking help. Karen Whitmore visited Margaret's home personally, presenting herself as kind and professional and genuinely concerned about helping a struggling widow. She spent 2 hours in Margaret's living room, surrounded by family photographs and Thomas's military medals displayed proudly on the mantel, listening sympathetically to Margaret's story while internally calculating exactly how much profit she could extract from this vulnerable elderly woman. The contract that Karen presented to Margaret was 47 pages of dense legal terminology with the most important clauses buried in microscopic print that Margaret's aging eyes could barely see even with her reading glasses. Karen assured Margaret that this was simply a loan assistance program that would help her manage her property taxes while allowing her to stay in her home for the rest of her life, that the monthly payments would be far lower than what she was currently struggling to afford, that everything would be easier and she would no longer have to worry about losing her home. Margaret trusted Karen because she seemed professional and kind, because she had spent hours listening to Margaret's stories about Thomas and their life together, because Margaret couldn't imagine that another woman would deliberately deceive and exploit an elderly widow during one of the most vulnerable periods of her life. Margaret signed the papers that Karen placed in front of her, not understanding that she had just transferred the deed of her home to Karen's company for $60,000, roughly 16% of the property's actual market value. The realization of what she had done came 30 days later when an eviction notice arrived at the home where Margaret had lived for 50 years, informing her that she had 30 days to vacate the premises that now belonged to Whitmore Properties LLC. The nightmare that followed nearly destroyed Margaret physically and emotionally. Her children immediately hired a lawyer who reviewed the contract and confirmed their worst fears that their mother had been the victim of a predatory scheme, that the document she had signed was deliberately deceptive and likely fraudulent, but that fighting Karen Whitmore's team of expensive attorneys would cost tens of thousands of dollars that the family simply didn't have. Margaret's health deteriorated rapidly from the stress and emotional trauma of facing eviction from the home where she had raised her children and lived with her beloved Thomas. She developed severe anxiety that manifested in panic attacks and insomnia. She stopped eating and lost 23 pounds in 6 weeks, and her children watched helplessly as their mother broke down mentally and physically under the weight of betrayal and impending loss. The local community rallied around Margaret's case when word spread about what had happened, with small business owners and neighbors contributing to a legal fund that eventually raised $3,000, a touching gesture that demonstrated the community's support but was nowhere near enough to wage an effective legal battle against Karen Whitmore's $500,000 annual legal budget. Margaret's case became a symbol within the neighborhood of elder exploitation and corporate greed, with community members organizing protests outside Karen's office and contacting local media about the injustice being done to a beloved elderly neighbor. What Karen Whitmore didn't know was that Margaret's pro bono attorney, a solo practitioner named David Richardson who had taken the case because his own grandmother had been scammed by a similar predatory scheme years earlier, had contacted the producers of Judge Judy's show with detailed documentation of the case and its broader implications. The producers immediately recognized that this case represented something far more significant than a typical small claims dispute, that it had the potential to expose a pattern of criminal behavior and deliver the kind of justice that rarely happened in the real world. When the case was flagged for Judge Judy's personal review, she spent 3 full nights reading through 200 pages of evidence, recognizing patterns similar to cases she had seen during her 25 years as a family court judge in Manhattan. Judge Judy personally contacted former colleagues at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, reached out to connections in federal law enforcement, and requested that the FBI's white-collar crime unit review the evidence that David Richardson had compiled. What started as a television court case quickly evolved into something much larger and more significant, a coordinated effort between Judge Judy's investigative resources, federal law enforcement, and state prosecutors to build an airtight criminal case against Karen Whitmore, using her television appearance as the catalyst for her complete destruction. Judge Judy's preparation for the Karen Whitmore case was unlike anything in her decades of television courtroom experience. She obtained warrants for Karen's business records through her law enforcement contacts, spending 72 consecutive hours reviewing 15 years of contracts, property transfers, and financial transactions. What she discovered was a pattern so consistent and so deliberately predatory that it met the legal definition of criminal enterprise under federal RICO statutes. Karen had used nearly identical contract language across 67 separate transactions, targeting elderly homeowners with limited English proficiency in 83% of cases, and coordinating with the same document forger to create false property inspection reports that justified her lowball offers. Judge Judy found evidence that Karen had paid off building inspectors to declare homes uninhabitable when they were actually in excellent condition, creating artificial urgency and fear that pushed victims to accept her terms. She discovered shell companies that Karen used to hide the true profits from property flips, avoiding taxes and making it difficult for victims to track where their homes actually ended up. Most damning of all, Judge Judy obtained recorded conversations where Karen discussed her targets with employees using terms like marks and suckers, laughing about how easy it was to manipulate elderly immigrants who trusted her. Judge Judy coordinated with FBI Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who had been investigating Karen for 18 months on an unrelated tax evasion case, and together they built a prosecution strategy that would use Karen's television appearance as the trigger for a coordinated federal and state takedown. The day of the taping arrived with an atmosphere unlike any normal Judge Judy episode. The gallery was packed with Margaret's family members, community supporters wearing Justice for Margaret buttons, and local news reporters who had been tipped off that something significant was about to happen. Karen Whitmore arrived in her chauffeur-driven Bentley Continental, stepping out in a $6,000 Armani suit with $50,000 worth of diamond jewelry glittering on her wrists and fingers. She carried an alligator skin briefcase worth $15,000 and brought a team of 3 attorneys despite the show's rules prohibiting legal representation, making them wait in the hallway while she prepared to demolish what she viewed as a pathetic attempt by a confused elderly woman to challenge a legitimate business transaction. Margaret Chin arrived on the city bus, wearing a simple dress purchased at Target for $19, carrying a worn folder containing family photographs and the documents that represented 50 years of her life. She was surrounded by her 3 adult children and 5 grandchildren, her hands shaking as she clutched the folder against her chest, terrified but determined to fight for the home where she had built her American dream with Thomas. Judge Judy opened the proceedings with her characteristic directness, reviewing the basic facts that Margaret Chin was suing Karen Whitmore for fraudulent acquisition of her home and seeking its return plus damages. Margaret's testimony was delivered softly and with dignity despite her limited English, her voice breaking with emotion as she described 50 years in the home she and Thomas had purchased, showing Judge Judy photographs of her children growing up in that house and family celebrations around the dining room table that Karen had now claimed as her property. Margaret explained how Karen's letter had frightened her with warnings about foreclosure, how Karen had visited her home and seemed so kind and understanding, how the contract was filled with words Margaret couldn't fully comprehend but Karen assured her it was simply help she needed. When Margaret described the moment the eviction notice arrived, her voice cracked completely as she said she couldn't breathe and thought she was having a heart attack, that she couldn't understand how the woman who had seemed so nice could take away everything she and Thomas had worked for their entire lives. Her daughter had to help translate some portions of her testimony as Margaret became too emotional to continue in English, and several people in the gallery were visibly crying as they listened to this elderly widow describe the systematic destruction of her life by a woman who viewed her as nothing more than a profit opportunity. The evidence Margaret presented was devastating in its simplicity and clarity. The original contract with its microscopic fine print that even young people with perfect vision would struggle to read. The professional home appraisal showing the property was worth $380,000 in excellent condition. The payment receipt showing Karen's company had paid Margaret only $60,000, roughly 16% of the home's actual value. The property record showing Karen had sold the home just 45 days later for $425,000, generating a profit of $365,000 on a single transaction with an elderly widow. Margaret's medical records documented the severe anxiety, panic attacks, and depression that had hospitalized her twice in the months following the eviction notice. Letters from Karen's company used threatening language about legal consequences if Margaret didn't vacate immediately, demonstrating the psychological warfare tactics Karen employed against her victims. The timeline David Richardson had constructed showed the coordinated pressure campaign, how Karen's employees had called Margaret daily with increasingly aggressive demands, how they had shown up at her home with moving company estimates, how they had contacted her children's employers in an apparent attempt to embarrass the family into compliance. Every piece of evidence painted a picture of calculated cruelty directed at a vulnerable elderly woman who had done nothing wrong except trust someone who presented herself as wanting to help. When Judge Judy invited Karen Whitmore to present her defense, Karen strutted to the plaintiff's area with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for her predatory behavior. She didn't acknowledge Margaret at all, didn't even glance in the direction of the elderly woman whose life she had destroyed, instead focusing her attention on Judge Judy as if this were simply a business negotiation between equals. Karen checked her phone repeatedly while Margaret had been testifying, rolling her eyes dramatically during the emotional portions, whispering loudly enough for the microphones to catch her saying, "This is such a waste of my time and I have actual business to conduct." Judge Judy's first warning look came during these displays of disrespect, the expression that experienced viewers recognized as the calm before a devastating storm, but Karen was too consumed by her own sense of superiority to recognize the danger she was creating for herself. Karen's opening statement dripped with condescension as she characterized the case as simple buyer's remorse, claiming that Margaret Chen had signed a legitimate contract and was now experiencing regret about a voluntary business decision. She dismissed Margaret's limited English proficiency as not my problem, stating that if Margaret didn't understand what she was signing she should have hired a translator at her own expense. Karen claimed her $60,000 offer had been generous under the circumstances because the property needed significant repairs that Margaret couldn't afford, conveniently ignoring the professional inspection report showing the home was in excellent condition. Karen's casual cruelty became more apparent with every word she spoke, referring to Margaret as this woman instead of using her name, describing elderly homeowners as these people who always claimed they didn't understand contracts they signed. The phrase "these people" caused audible gasps from the gallery, the thinly veiled prejudice obvious to everyone watching except Karen herself, who seemed genuinely confused about why anyone would find her language offensive or inappropriate. Judge Judy began pressing Karen about specific details of the transaction, asking about the home inspection report that allegedly justified the lowball offer, and Karen confidently claimed the property was nearly condemned and required extensive repairs. Judge Judy calmly produced the actual professional inspection report showing the home was in excellent condition with no significant issues, and Karen's face flushed as she stammered that her inspector must have been more thorough than the one Margaret hired. Judge Judy's voice took on an edge as she noted that Karen's inspector happened to be her brother-in-law, and Karen defensively insisted that was irrelevant because he was properly licensed. Judge Judy then revealed that Karen's brother-in-law had his license suspended 2 years earlier for filing fraudulent inspection reports in unrelated cases, and produced emails showing Karen was fully aware of this suspension when she used him for Margaret's property. Karen tried to claim she didn't know about the suspension at the time, but Judge Judy presented time-stamped emails proving that was a lie, and the first visible crack appeared in Karen's confident facade. Judge Judy shifted her questioning to Karen's other property acquisitions, asking how many similar transactions she had completed in the past 5 years, and Karen became immediately defensive, stating she didn't see how that was relevant to this specific case. Judge Judy's response was swift and sharp, informing Karen that she would decide what was relevant in her courtroom, not the other way around. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh of frustration, the kind of dismissive sound she had probably used countless times when dealing with people she viewed as beneath her, and the courtroom atmosphere shifted instantly. Judge Judy leaned forward with laser focus, asking if Karen had just cited her in disrespect, and Karen incredibly doubled down on her arrogance, saying with unmistakable condescension that Judge Judy clearly didn't understand real estate law and these contracts were standard industry practice. The silence that followed was absolute, every person in the courtroom recognizing that Karen had just crossed a line that nobody crosses with Judge Judy, but Karen herself seemed oblivious to the magnitude of her mistake. Judge Judy's voice dropped to that dangerously quiet tone that had made seasoned attorneys break into cold sweats, asking Karen if she was suggesting that defrauding elderly people was standard industry practice, and Karen's voice rose defensively as she insisted she had never defrauded anyone and was simply a legitimate businesswoman. She pointed at Margaret dismissively, stating that Margaret had made a bad business decision and that wasn't Karen's fault, that in the real world people are responsible for reading what they sign. Judge Judy began systematically presenting evidence of Karen's pattern of behavior, pulling out documents from 10 other cases with nearly identical contract language, nearly identical lowball offers, nearly identical targeting of elderly victims with limited English. Karen interrupted repeatedly, her voice rising with each interruption, insisting that Judge Judy couldn't use sealed settlement documents, that this was a setup and ambush, that Judge Judy was clearly biased and had already decided against her before hearing all the evidence. Judge Judy calmly noted that nothing was sealed in her courtroom, that she had obtained everything through proper legal channels, and that the only thing she had decided was that Karen Whitmore was a predator who systematically exploited vulnerable people. Karen's face turned bright red as she called Judge Judy's evidence garbage and hearsay, but then Judge Judy produced bank records showing the exact pattern of profits from property flips, the shell companies used to hide income, the coordination with the same document forger across multiple transactions. Karen demanded to know how Judge Judy had obtained private financial records, claiming it was illegal, and Judge Judy held up a federal subpoena, explaining that she was very good at obtaining such documents when investigating fraud. Karen tried one final manipulation tactic, invoking her wealth and connections as a form of intimidation, telling Judge Judy that she had no idea who she was dealing with, that Karen had powerful friends and resources beyond imagination. She listed politicians she had donated to, lawyers who had successfully defended her, and implied that people like her don't lose to people like Margaret, pointing dismissively at the elderly widow sitting quietly with her family. Judge Judy's voice went ice cold as she responded that people like Margaret built America through hard work and sacrifice, while people like Karen built nothing except wealth stolen from those who trusted them. Karen scoffed audibly, making the fatal mistake of saying that Margaret was nobody while she was somebody who mattered. Judge Judy began reading her ruling, stating she was finding in favor of plaintiff Margaret Chin and awarding $320,000 in damages and attorney fees, and Karen exploded from her seat screaming that this was insane and completely unacceptable. Judge Judy ordered Karen to sit down immediately, but Karen refused, her voice shaking with rage as she insisted Judge Judy didn't understand who she was dealing with, that this ruling would be overturned, that Karen had resources to fight this forever. Karen approached the bench in direct violation of courtroom protocol, the bailiff moving toward her, and Karen whirled on Judge Judy with her finger pointing directly at the judge's face. Karen's voice dripped with venom and absolute entitlement as she said, "Listen to me very carefully, you insignificant little judge," declaring that she owned this town, owned the lawyers, owned the politicians who made the rules. She took one more step forward, locked eyes with Judge Judy, and said with deliberate emphasis on each word, "I own you." The 3 seconds of silence that followed felt like an eternity, every person frozen in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Judge Judy stood slowly from her chair, something she almost never did during proceedings, and her voice when she spoke was whisper quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. She asked if Karen had just told her that she owned her, and Karen incredibly doubled down, saying that Judge Judy heard exactly what was said, that people like Judge Judy were bought and paid for, that Karen could buy and sell her 10 times over. Judge Judy ordered the bailiff to secure the exits, and confusion spread through the courtroom as Karen demanded to know what was happening. Judge Judy opened a folder marked FBI evidence and began reading from an investigation report detailing Karen's 15-year criminal enterprise, the 67 victims across 3 states, the $4.7 million in fraudulent profits, the coordination with document forgers and corrupt building inspectors, the shell companies hiding income from the IRS. Karen's smirk finally disappeared as Judge Judy listed federal charges being prepared including wire fraud carrying 20 years in prison, 67 counts of elder abuse, racketeering under RICO statutes, tax evasion of $1.2 million, bribery of public officials, conspiracy to commit fraud and multiple counts of forgery. The courtroom doors opened and FBI agents entered, followed by IRS agents and state prosecutors, and Special Agent Rodriguez approached Karen to place her under arrest as Judge Judy declared that Karen should have thought about consequences before telling a judge she owned her, and that in this courtroom justice wasn't for sale and arrogance always meets accountability.